Welcome, everybody. And any people who are out there, you can usher back in this way. Welcome to this evening, to our pub talk for October. My name's Doug Messer. For those of you that I don't know, I'm one of the ministers here at Cedar Springs and just really excited about tonight. Thankful for the privilege of being able to gather and discuss and be together around this topic. And if you've seen the topic, we've titled it, let me remember what the title is here first. Race, Relationships, the Gap in Understanding, and Reconciliation. It's a long title, but as I thought about that, I thought that's what it encompasses. That's my son, Charlie, so he's up there. It encompasses more than that, but it's kind of a broad swath about the unique dynamic of this conversation. And before I introduce you to our first two guests, I wanted to kind of frame this conversation with a couple thoughts. As far as being a Christian goes, and as far as the idea of reconciliation and justice goes, I had never really heard anybody talk about this in the churches that I was growing up in, or as a child, or even as an adult. Early on, I didn't really hear conversations about justice and race in terms of the context of how that relates to faith in the scriptures. When I went to seminary at Gordon Conwell Seminary in Boston, one of the most important classes I ever took was a class called Christianity and the Problem of Racism. And it was important because it wasn't just a conversation where white professors talked about, from a white perspective, about issues of justice or race. It was a conversation and a class that was held in the city with people from multiple races, ethnicities, and backgrounds. So it was such a privilege to be in that room. And let me acknowledge, it was really uncomfortable to talk about for all of us. So I look back on that and I go, but that was part of what made that time so important. Not only as I think about justice and race and issues that revolve around those things, but for my own journey spiritually. It gave me different eyes to see things through. The conversation did. So let me just frame this real quickly with the scriptures. It's something that I wrote a few years back that focused on Genesis 12. And I'm not going to read my words, but I'm going to read a British theologian named John Stott who talked about God's covenant with Abraham in Genesis 12 in verse 3. And he says, he believed Genesis 12 verses 1 through 4 were, quote, perhaps the most unifying verses in the Bible, where, quote, the whole of God's purpose is encapsulated. And what he was covenanting with Abraham about was that Abraham and his lineage, the seed of Abraham, would be a blessing to all the nations of the earth. And by nations, the language is people groups. Stott said this: we should never allow ourselves to forget that the Bible begins with the universe, not with the planet Earth. Then with the earth, not with Palestine. Then with Adam, the father of the human race, not with Abraham, the father of a chosen race. Since then, God is the creator of the universe, the earth, and all mankind. We must never demote him to the status of a tribal deity or a petty godling like Shamash, the god of the Moabites. Nor must we suppose that God chose Abraham and his descendants because he had lost interest in other peoples or given up on them. Election is not a synonym for elitism. I read that and I thought, wow, that puts context to any conversation about people groups, nations, justice, God's heart for the world. In Exodus 12, verses 37 and 38, it makes this type of diverse missionary God very clear, not only as out there that will go to those people, but as who leaves Egypt that makes up the Israelites. And it says, the Israelites journeyed about 600,000 men on foot besides children. A mixed crowd also went up with them. That language means diversity of ethnicity, of skin tone, of background that went up, and that is who left Egypt to become, years later, a nation of Israel. So it wasn't just the Semitic people, Abraham's line, that made up the nation state or even the people group, ultimately, of Israel. Why do I bring that up? I think we lose sight of that in the church. I think we lose sight of God's sweep of that reality. And Calvin is going to bring some specifics to that in a few minutes. But I wanted to set the stage with that idea in mind, that from the beginning, God's mindset is a mixed group of people. Not just to begin with, but when we read Revelation, that's how it ends. So, I'll pause there and take a moment to introduce. I'm going to let Doug Bannister introduce himself in a few minutes, but Doug is a friend of Cedar Springs, and he's the head pastor at All Souls Church downtown, and I think probably many of us know him in here. So I'm going to keep it simple with Doug. But I got my introduction for Calvin in text, so I'm going to pull this out real quick and give you a little background. That's right. And along with Calvin, we have 3 other panelists that will be joining us, and I will introduce them as they come up. Calvin Skinner graduated from the University of Tennessee with a bachelor's in science, and then went on to Palmer Seminary, where he earned his master's in divinity. Presently, Calvin works as a national community organizer, mobilizing interdenominational congregations around voter empowerment and civic engagement. Additionally, Calvin does leadership development work with the Skinner Institute in Washington, D.C. Ultimately, Calvin is committed to raising up the next generation of Christ-centered leaders. So I hand it off to Calvin Skinner.
It's certainly a pleasure to be here this evening. Thank you, Pastor. Thank you to Cedar Springs and the other panelists, Brother Bannister, for this wonderful opportunity, this unique opportunity, this important conversation. I feel that is often, folks feel hesitant to approach and to address, but as a Knoxville native, I grew up here. To give you some background, although I've been away for almost 12 years now, there's still a heart, for Knoxville, for my family is here. My folks are actually in the audience tonight.
Calvin, do we have your mic on right? Yeah, okay, good.
We're on?
Yeah, we good?
You can hear me, okay?
Okay, sorry, excuse me.
And so it gives me a great delight because I like I said, there's a heart that I have for Knoxville. So to help you understand where I get my heart and my passion, especially around bridge building and engaging around matters of race and dialoguing cross-culturally, let me paint a picture of how I was brought up. First of all, I am rooted. My parents often remind me of my New York roots, right? Wonderful city, yes. And, you know, somehow we moved around a bit. My father, who pastors, was called to a congregation in Ohio, which was great exposure, you know, there growing up as a young child, you know, pretty much really didn't have to wrestle with matters of race, you know, at 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? Well, when I came to Knoxville, Tennessee, we moved here in 91. Of all places, my parents moved to Knoxville, and they put me in a school called Bluegrass Elementary. Y'all know Bluegrass Elementary, right? So I'm like, okay, fine. If I have to do this, I guess I have to go to school. So, but Bluegrass, we'll see how this goes. I go into the class, and I look around, and for the first time ever, I recognize that nobody looks like me. Not even one person looks like me. I was like, okay, well, it's just morning time, maybe mid-afternoon. Nobody looks like me. All right, fine. Well, the school is about 1,000 people strong. Okay, we'll recess. I will engage somebody who looks like recess. Nobody looks like me. Okay, not a problem until kickball. Okay, it comes kickball time. And of course, there's captains, and there's, I guess, the coolest person comes to captain, and they choose who they want on their team. Nobody picked me up. So Andy Yates was from Gatlinburg, Tennessee. And I will say I appreciate the Southern accent. I tell you that anytime I go up, well, as I am up north, people know instantly that I'm not from the city, particularly from the north, because of my accent. But people from Gatlinburg have even more distinct accent, right? So somehow Andy Yates, who has this distinct accent from Gatlinburg, Tennessee, and I, who came from New York with New York roots, opposite ends of the spectrum, somehow became great friends. Because interesting enough, as they treated me differently, I would assume because of the color of my skin, they treated Andy differently as well. Maybe because he didn't necessarily come from, you know, Knoxville in particular, but for whatever reason, as I became aware of, you know, the certain distinctions and even the fact that you can be treated a certain way because of how people might perceive you, although Andy came from an opposite end of the spectrum, this has always, like, this resonated with me as I thought about engaging people who don't necessarily look or think like I do or speak. So fast forward, you know, years later and particular circumstances later, fast forward through personal situations where I was pulled over by the police simply because I was racially profiled. A few times the police officer, when I was pulled over, said specifically, you were pulled over because you don't look like you belong in this neighborhood. Fast forward to situations where I had to confront matters where folks who were bigoted intentionally, you know, engage a group of my friends in a way to scare us and to harass us because of the color of our skin. You know, fast forward to even certain opportunities I had to engage in these kind of conversations where
good-hearted folks, good-hearted white Christians who said, yes, I want to talk about and deal with this racial matter, these issues, these complex issues. But somewhere, somehow, 2, 3 steps in, because the conversations got too rough, too tough, it was abandoned. I'm rooted in this, which keeps me hopeful, which keeps me passionate about working this thing out. In the prayer that Jesus taught his disciples, he said, "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." And this is it. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. This is what keeps me grounded and keeps me mindful, it keeps me motivated and keeps me hopeful about this charge as a kingdom ambassador, that God is working this kingdom thing out. What is going on in heaven, if people are going to figure out what's going on in heaven, they should be able to look at God's people here on earth. And that resonates fully as I seek, as we seek to have these kind of conversations, that our witness, how people come to know Christ and come to know what the kingdom is all about, is how we interact, is how we engage. Even in spite of our own notions, our own understandings that, yes, we have the opportunity to show the world what God is doing up in heaven. That's how crucial these conversations are, that soul salvation hinges upon how we engage one another cross-culturally, cross-economic lines. And it's demonstrated through the work of Jesus Christ. And what's so beautiful about this kingdom call, that I'm going to have certain notions about how I perceive my white brother and sister. So forgive me. I'm working through it. I'm working it out. But I'm hopeful that as we work it out, that there will be patience, that there will be an understanding that this place can be safe, that yes, I might have certain notions, but because we're trying to work it out together, because we all are striving for the same thing, we are trying to represent Christ and who Christ is through his love and through his grace and through his peace, that it's going to be okay, that we're going to stick through this. We're going to stick to this. And we also understand that this thing it's not easy. The kingdom call is not easy. It can get messy. It can get uncomfortable. But through it, think about the richness of developing authentic and great relationships with people who you wouldn't necessarily engage or talk with. I think about, lastly, I'll leave with this, about how Christ has demonstrated wonderful grace. That anybody who came into his presence, regardless of where they came from, who they were, he saw value in them. I think about the young boy who came with his fish and loaves. And I wonder if this young boy was in our society today, would he be dismissed? Because you remember, if you might remember that story, Christ was seeking, well, there was thousands who were seeking to be fed. They were hungry, and this boy just came with what he had. He could have been easily dismissed because what he had was not sufficient for the entire crowd. But Christ, because of who he is, was able to take that which what the boy had and feed the masses. And that's our call, that we can't dismiss somebody just because they look like they don't belong, or they look like what they have isn't enough, isn't plenty, isn't sufficient. But we know as believers that what we do for God's people, God will take that which is little and provide more than we can ask. But the question is, how are we approaching it? What is our attitude towards those things, those persons who don't look like us or think like us or don't have the resources that we think they should have? That's the gospel.
Amen. Amen. Thank you. Because his dad, Dr. Skinner, is one of my mentors. And Johnny and I get together about once a month, and he picks a book, and we read it and just talk, and I learn from him. And one day he said, I've lost all my best and brightest, or many of my best and brightest young people to other cities. And I said, really, why? And he said, go ask them. And so I spent the summer interviewing African-American leaders, both here and in other communities. And they said there are three reasons why so many of them didn't stay in Knoxville. One was opportunity. One was culture. There weren't enough things that they enjoyed doing culturally. And the third was race, that they bumped into some racial resistance here. And they were always reluctant to talk about that, but that always came up. And so when the Pub Talk folks came down and said, would you come speak? I said, this is kind of what's on my heart. And they prayed about it and said, we think that's a good conversation to have. And so we decided that we'd start out tonight laying a little bit of a theology of reconciliation. And as I began to prepare, the first thing that struck me was that I don't have one. I have a theology about everything else. I could talk to you about the Nephilim in Genesis 6, but I don't know much. I don't have much of a theology. I have been in 2 great evangelical seminaries for 7 years. I didn't take one class on race. I didn't have one black professor. I didn't have one black student in my class. I didn't read one book by a black writer. And so this was just not on my screen for many, many years. Now, how do you spend 25, 30 years in ministry and not think about racial reconciliation? Well, as I thought about it, 2 reasons. One is the few experiences I had with it were just lame. And I'll just name one, and I don't mean to be mean-spirited here, but I was at a pastor's conference years ago. It was a Promise Keepers Pastors Conference. There were 25,000 of us in the Atlanta Dome, and at one point, essentially they said, everybody stand up and go find a black guy and apologize to him. And it was just weird. It just was weird. And the poor black guys were nice about it, but it's like, 20,000 white guys. I'm so sorry. It's like, this doesn't help. And then honestly, I think for most of my life, I felt like we were a post-racial, colorblind society. It just wasn't something that I thought a lot about. And it started to change, first of all, with Johnny, as we'd spend time together, and our churches did some things together, more often than not just sitting in his office talking and reading some of the things that he gave me. Began to coach a swim team with a lot of families who were African American, and got close enough to where they were on my cell phone, and I was in their houses and knew it was in their refrigerators. And then I started to realize, wow, there are some real issues here that I didn't see. And I think I'm realizing that there still is an issue, that we are far from a just society. I got an email from a doctor in our congregation who lives in Mechanicsville that I thought illustrated that. This is from this week. He said, I've been trying to start a Bible study for 3 to 4 guys I know in the neighborhood, and I had 3 of them over to my house one evening last week. 2 of them drove in together, and I happened to look out my front door to see them handcuffed and sitting on the bumper of their car with 4 white policemen questioning them. One of the officers knocked on the door, talked to me for a minute to confirm that I knew them, and he said that if the computer cleared them, they were going to be let free. They were let go and came inside. It sounds like there was nothing they had against these guys and found nothing in the car. It highlighted some of the challenges of being a young black man. And honestly, those are just experiences that I just never have. My niece was a police officer for a while, but I think most of our African American friends would have hundreds of these kind of experiences. So these conversations with Calvin and his father have been very, very helpful to me, and just to try to start to think through what does the Bible say about this. And I think Calvin started with the kingdom, and that's where we need to start. 2 passages have been helpful to me. One is Ephesians 2. I'll just read part of it. But now in Christ Jesus, you who once were far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made the 2 groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility. And as Calvin was saying, the idea is that because of sin, we are alienated from God and from each other. Because of the cross, we're reconciled to God and to each other. And so that makes it possible for reconciliation to occur. And then in Galatians 3, it says, so in Christ Jesus you are all children of God through faith. For all of you who were baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. There's neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free. There's neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. So God's vision for humanity is this reconciled community that Dr. King called the beloved community. That's what God is doing in the world. And, I don't think most of us would disagree with that, but what strikes me is it just seems like the church has stalled out since the civil rights movement. That there are some notable exceptions, of course, but by and large, it just seems like beyond getting 25,000 pastors to cry in the Atlanta Dome, we just really haven't gone anywhere with this. And so often the things that we've tried to do seem forced and contrived and just not all that helpful. And so I was trying to think through, how to end this little piece here on, what do we do with this? If this is God's vision for the beloved community, that it would be diverse and reflect the beauty of the full image of God, what are we supposed to do? I really came up short. The only thing I know to start with is, for me, it's begun, honestly, in Johnny Skinner's office. It's begun by having Keisha's cell. I know when her footsteps run out, and I've been in her home, and I know when her husband, I know her, and I'm starting to understand the pain and the suffering that a lot of my friends experience. When I was doing the research for this article, at one point a guy, I have a computer because I don't write very well, and I always take notes, and he said, can we go off the record? And I closed the computer, and And just big, tough, strong guy. And he just, his eyes teared up, and for the next 45 minutes, he talked to me about how painful it was to be a black man in Knoxville, Tennessee. And he said, don't print any of that. And honestly, it's just those kind of conversations. If you realize one of your family members is really hurting, that's when you realize, okay, it's not all good. We've got to keep moving towards this.
Let me introduce first from left to right. This is Carla McAnders, and she is an associate professor of law at UT. Her background, she has her BA from Spelman College in Atlanta in political science and French, and came here last year at Villanova, right? Is that where you were teaching before?
Yes.
Yeah. And so since 2008, she has directed UT's Immigration Clinic, where she, along with her students, provide legal representation to immigrants who cannot afford counsel. Her work has taken her around the country and internationally to advocate for social justice on behalf of immigrants. Professor McAnders' scholarly writings focus on educating lawyers to be social justice advocates, immigration, and human rights law. So that's Carla. Kelly Coleman, some of you may recognize Kelly. She's around this community. She's part of this community. So Kelly has a BA in journalism from Elon. And I love what Kelly wrote to me. I really appreciate this. She said, I moved to Knoxville from Virginia about 2 years ago to participate in the Knoxville Fellows Program. That's how she knows Doug. And now serve as Director of Recruitment and the Chair of the Spiritual Direction Committee for the Fellows Alumni Network. She also works for a local restaurant and catering company, helping run daily operations and handling marketing efforts. She says, I have fallen in love with the city of Knoxville over the past 2 years, and she attends All Souls. Janetta Jamerson Maurer was born and raised in Middle Tennessee. She attended MTSU for her undergrad and has a psychology degree from there, and she went on to get her PhD at UK in clinical psychology. And let's see, her grandparents were active in the civil rights movement, and she currently practices as a psychologist in Knoxville. So thank y'all for being here. Welcome, and I appreciate y'all being here. I will acknowledge something. I thought, this is always a difficult conversation whenever you have it. It just, because it is. And, but I said, my thoughts were, it can be, sometimes, particularly those of us who are white who don't have to think about race. I think we'll touch on something called white privilege a little bit tonight. And that stirs things inside of some of you, and that's okay. Just that phrase, and that's all right. But we don't have to think about it. I was thinking, well, we want y'all to be comfortable, but then I thought, well, no, it's not really about being comfortable. And then I thought, well, especially since these four folks are up here, and the predominance of this crowd, like the predominance of our community and the schools that we attend, and is they are regularly in the minority. We are regularly in the majority. And again, that sense of not having to think about race is a majority-minority dynamic. So I just want to acknowledge that up front. And it's a challenge, and it's a real privilege that we get to sit and hear from them. So I'm going to just ask you all a basic question, and feel free to take it in any direction you'd like. One of the questions I thought would be just simple and a good springboard for us is this. Could you all tell us, as learners, and I think we're here tonight because we're learners, we want to learn, we want to know, as brothers and sisters in Christ particularly. Could you tell us one thing, maybe more than one thing, but some things, that we don't know about this dynamic, this reality, that you wish we did know about issues of race, about being a minority versus being a majority, about what life is like, that you wish we knew?
I think as a professor, one of the things that I work with my students with is teaching them about the things that we carry around with ourselves, how we're socialized, what we learn, how our background impacts our interactions with other people. And I think that when my parents grew up and my grandparents grew up, that racism was very overt. You couldn't use certain bathrooms or you couldn't go in certain places. But I think that now it's more of a consideration of what things have I learned or what things am I carrying around with me, what biases might I have that impact my interactions with my African American friends, with my Latino friends, with my Asian friends. And so I think that racism is not overt today, but there are implicit things that we carry around with us that we might not be aware of. I do this exercise called What's in My Briefcase with my students, where I have them kind of examine like certain sentence stems, like I think immigrants are, my interactions with African Americans are XYZ, and I have them kind of think about what their feelings are and how that might impact their interactions with their clients when they come into the clinic. So I think that the thing that is important today is just looking at, how have I grown up? What kind of context have I grown up in? And how might that impact the way I treat another person?
I'll jump in. I don't know if, as you said, things that we don't know. I'm going to assume y'all don't know this because I didn't know this. And I grew up in a civil rights legacy in my family. So I heard a lot about race and race relations, things like that. But not until I was doing my internship, which is the last step before you getting your PhD, did I learn this. I sat through a seminar, and one of the things that we watched this video called Race, the Power of an Illusion, and I would encourage everybody to watch that. So what I learned is that race is, the way we think about race, how we look at each other and we see our differences, it really is so much of an illusion because the biological basis is not exactly what we would expect based on the differences that we have now. For instance, my husband's a white man with blonde hair and blue eyes, and it's possible that we have a more closely linked DNA structure than I would with Calvin. It blew my mind, so I'm sure you all didn't know that. If you knew that, then you're amazing. So the problems that we see in society, we've created because they really aren't, they didn't exist in our biology. That's stuff that we created. So, for instance, an example is, we look at slavery in America. Whenever, the slave catchers brought the Africans over and enslaved us, instead of just saying that we're doing this because we can, because we have the power, because we have the resources to, they decided to talk about why black folks were inferior and why this was justified. And this begins racism in America. Had they just said we're doing this because we can, and these people are no different from us, we may not see some of the problems that we do now. So when you ask what can we do with that, well, if we recognize that we have the power to create it, then that also means that we have the power to undo it.
That's a good point. It's interesting because to summarize that in a phrase that I've heard, race being a social construct. That may not be language you're familiar with. That's if you didn't study that type of thing, but that's an interesting point. But think of it maybe as we created it. It's a social construct, the concept even. So thanks for sharing that, Janetta. Appreciate that. Anybody?
So, if 2 years ago you would not catch me dead talking about race, I didn't really. It's not something I'm super comfortable in talking about. I'm actually sweating profusely right now. But it's something that has become really important to me. And as I was thinking about that question that Doug asked, there are so many things that came to my mind, but the thing that kept coming back was something that I find is really important to me as a just Black woman, and that is that, you know, if we think about and discuss anything like this, anything related to race, if we're talking about racial reconciliation, if we're talking about events that happen in our country that are racially charged, if we are talking about anything related to race, it's critical to have an attitude of humility. And I know that that's so like la-di-da, touchy-feely, but I sense that so much. And I think because there's so much we don't know. I mean, you start wading in, if your eyes are open, you realize how complex it is and how much there is that we can't know and fully understand, that you won't ever know and fully understand about, you know, being Black, or that I will fully understand about you because you have your own set of experiences and perspectives. And so I just, I think it's so important to have a posture and an understanding of that. Because I think, I don't know, I think it's very hard, I think, for me, and very almost disturbing and uncomfortable for me to engage with people or to hear comments that are very strongly worded or very charged. And to just, you know, that is isolating, I think. And so, yeah, I don't know. I know that that's sort of a basic thing, but I think is so important in conversations, and whether that's in a discussion like this, or if I'm having a conversation with another Black person, or if I'm having a conversation with a white person, it doesn't matter the context. I think having that humility and understanding just how much we don't know is so important.
We have, you know, conversations around race that I want us to be okay with the fact that we don't have to pretend with, you know, how we feel or what we think. And I think this is a good example. I often hear when I have conversations with my brothers and sisters around race and they don't feel comfortable talking about it, they share that, well, you know what? I don't see race because I'm colorblind, right? How many of y'all heard that, right? Or say that? How many of us say that? But the goal isn't to necessarily be colorblind, because there's something special, something unique that each culture, each individual brings. And to say that we're colorblind, I would say it's not a notion of dismissing somebody by virtue of, you know, the race. So what I mean is, just because somebody is a certain race, a certain hue, the understanding is we don't dismiss them because of that. That we embrace them, that there's some value, that there's a perspective, a unique perspective that should be embraced.
I'm going to ask one more question, and would somebody be able to grab this? And in a few, we're going to open this up here in a little bit for more questions from the audience. But tying this in a little bit with some of the things Doug has written in the articles he's written for the News Sentinel, which, if you haven't gotten the chance to read those, ask a few of us, and we can tell you what the title of those are. All of you are professionals in different fields of work, backgrounds. Can you give us a little sense specifically within your profession of how this dynamic plays itself out a little bit within your field of work? Just naturally, where there's that you feel like it's not worried about, and some of the challenges, whether that's coming through school, or just professionally, are there challenges in that environment that have to do with you being African American?
I think a challenge that I dealt with when I first got here, I've been a professor for about 8 years now, but at Tennessee for 6 years. And when I first started at Tennessee and when I was in the north at Villanova, I think a combination of things because of my age and also being an African American woman, there was the assumption that certainly I could not be a professor in the school. You know, when I would get on elevators, people would, mistake me for somebody that was working at the law school. People would mistake me for a student. When I was going into faculty meetings, people would kind of look at me like, what are you doing here? And so that is one thing. I think it's, getting better in terms of we've definitely increased our diversity at the law school, but it's those types of assumptions that are made about your presence in certain environments that it makes it a little bit more difficult. And, as an African American woman that was on the tenure track to become a full professor, one of the things that I did was I overcompensated for the things that I thought, people were going to prejudge me about. So instead of publishing 2 articles for tenure, I published 6 articles plus a book. So I think that, I enjoy doing those things, but at the same time, I think that the assumptions that are made about you and your presence in certain environments can impact how you operate.
And before somebody goes, can you expand on that? The feeling, the need, or the sense that you have to do more than your contemporaries have to do.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that's just happened in law school, or is that something that
I think it's a way that I've learned to operate in different systems. When I was in high school, I was in a predominantly white environment. I was the student that was, the class president for 4 years. I was the homecoming queen, and I always put myself in those positions. And then at the same time, I felt like, with my white counterparts, that I was always having to prove or say, this is not how all African Americans are. And so I think that I've, done that. And there's a whole, not to be too academic, but theories of what are called microaggressions that occur to African Americans in these types of environments and contexts, and it impacts the way we interact with other people.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to say with psychology. I like to think that we're some of those folks who are leading the charge and making some of these changes because we're aware we have to be because it's what we study. So I can only speak from my own experience, but I don't really like to speak for the field as a whole because I think that we do a better job than some of the experiences that I've had. So I've had a lot of the same experiences that Carla has talked about, but also because I know that psychology is supposed to be responsible in this, I've had some concerns that are similar but maybe played out quite oppositely. Like when I got into grad school, I thought it was, I'm not bragging, but I am proud of this. It was a top 20 program. I have to claim that because I went to Kentucky and people need a reason for me to have gone to Kentucky. But, so it was a good program and 300 people applied, 7 got in. I was certain I was an experiment. I was certain of this. And it wasn't until the second semester of my first year that I had a professor that said, "What's it like being the only black student in this program?" And I was, really? You want me to tell you the truth? And it's like, I feel like you're going to debrief me the day I defend my dissertation and tell me that you brought me in to show that affirmative action works, that if we let people know that we believe in them and show them that we believe they can do it, that they'll pull it off. And that's exactly what I thought was going on. So I can't say that that's what psychology is about, but that's what it was like for me.
I'm just hearing that and just thinking about that. Well, that's just a small thing sitting in the back of your mind for your first year at the very least, along with all the other work you're doing. So that's an interesting.
It is interesting. I don't know if, I mean, I don't know if I can think of anything necessarily in the working world, but what you said, actually what both of you said, just resonated with me. But one thing that, I don't know, I found that to be true for myself of wondering, there's always that question of why opportunities are given to me. Like, is it because I'm, like, you need some color up in here? I mean, that's a real, and it's a hard thing because it almost invalidates you a little bit. You know, there's this feeling that, there's that question in your mind, oh, like, am I a part of this because you want, I mean, which is, I don't know. So I think that is a sort of continual, almost thought process that I think I've had really for a long time. I mean, through high school and college, and even now, you know, having opportunities and always having that question, you know, is this the reason that I'm here? Or is it because I am sort of qualified or have something that you want, you think I can offer? And so that is kind of, it's an insecurity, I think, and a sort of question that is kind of always there. So, yeah, I don't know.
I'll share most profoundly what stood out for me working at a Christian institution of higher education was, you know, I often assume that, you know, places of higher ed, you can have, you know, this freedom to exchange thoughts and ideas and exchange the wonderful diversity of thoughts and ideas, you know, from issues around, you know, women movement and working at a Christian institution, struggling with what the Trinity is all about. But it's somehow when issues that are racially charged came up, it would be ignored or avoided. You know, my sister actually here, Zanique, also part of that particular institution, can attest. You know, we often, when issues like Michael Brown, who was senselessly shot in Ferguson, or when I think about Jordan Davis or Eric Garner, if we seek to have conversations around, you know, those persons or those situations, we would be perceived as angry, or for my brothers and sisters, or my white brothers and sisters who felt uncomfortable about that conversation, they dictated that now is not the time. Let's wait till the facts come out. And for me, who can, you know, share and even identify with those particular issues, who, you know, feel that if any place, this should be the opportunity, this should be the place that I can share and we can exchange ideas and work through this, it, again, would be discouraged, ignored, said, let's wait a while.
I'm going to throw this out to you all, so folks, hopefully you've got some things, hopefully even from what's been said, some things stirring up in you, questions that you might have or would like to hear from our panelists. And we want you to know, and I know everybody up here, we talked about this, safe space. This is, I know sometimes we're hesitant to ask questions because we go, one, well, I'm going to look stupid or feel stupid, or I can't, you know, this will make me sound racist or ignorant or whatever. This is the space, this is why we're doing this. Trying to create space for that to happen, because when we don't ask those questions, the gap grows, which means misunderstanding grows greater, and then assumptions happen, and then we're way far from each other. So that's your invitation. Does anybody have any questions? Steve's got a microphone. Does anybody have any questions at this point?
I just want to reiterate, thank you all for doing this. I know it takes a lot of courage, and we're grateful. I had a question in the church context. It feels like to me in Knoxville, you almost have to choose a mostly black with a few white people church or a mostly white with a few black people church. I think I said that wrong, but you get the idea. Can you talk about what does this look like in church, and particularly in Knoxville, where or the South, I guess, where it feels like there's still very distinct black communities and white communities, and black churches and white churches. What has your experience been, and is there anything that we can do as Christians to what does that look like to as churches to lead in that movement when it feels like it's an uphill battle?
Well, again, it takes a commitment. It takes the willingness to say, okay, look, there's something that needs to be done. There's something particularly not right about this. And for us to even, make the connection, you think about our anchor institutions, which, the church is one of that. If the anchor institutions look a certain way, how do we expect the greater community to look differently? So, interesting enough, I am part of a fellowship in the Washington, D.C. area called Bridgeway, where it's a multicultural congregation. Much of the congregation is made up of all hues and all backgrounds. But what's most interesting is the leadership. The makeup of the leadership reflects the congregation. And if anything is going to transform, if anything is going to change, it's going to take the leadership to make it happen.
I think that's one thing I've struggled with in Knoxville is finding like a church home that gives me, the different aspects that I'm looking for. My sister lives in Atlanta and she goes to Buckhead Church. And I went to church with her and it was so diverse. I went in, it was kind of funny because it's diverse in that they have different types of music and everything. And the Sunday that I came in, they had beach balls flying around. Everybody was dancing and everything. So that's like one thing that I have struggled with because I like variety. I grew up in a Baptist church and I love gospel music. And then there are some things, that I like about, being, in a very diverse environment and connecting with people that have the same, experience. So I've kind of like church hopped around and gotten, different things from different environments that I need.
Thank you again for coming. I've already learned so much. Do you guys have any questions for us? We have various times where we meet throughout the week, and we could take these questions, or you could just ask us right now. I'd be willing to answer what I can, but maybe someone else. I just wanted to give you guys an opportunity to ask us any questions. Has this been helpful for you?
Oh. So this is where it gets hard. No.
Yeah.
No.
Okay, can I
That's
tell us why?
No, because, and even as you're asking that, I'm thinking, okay, so now it's like the onus is on us to and that's what I don't mind playing this role. I've always been like the black kid in every situation. It's like, so why's your hair like that? And I really coming from like a civil rights family, my parents just weren't very sensitive to the things that I went through as the only black kid and they were just like, really? It's not the back of the bus. And then before them, they can tell them worse things. So I do kind of see that this is the way for me to be active in the movement, is to have these hard conversations and talk about my experience and share what I have learned and what I have studied. But it doesn't, and I'm not saying these conversations are never enlightening, but I do find that often I'm in the role of the educator. And what I get out of it, I'll say, is that people care, and that feels good. It feels good that you're interested. So I guess it was a little unfair to say no. Maybe not so enlightening, but it feels good that you care. I'll say that.
I want to give you all the opportunity to ask questions of us to kind of put us up there on those seats. I mean, it'd be logistically hard for us to get up there, but yeah.
Yes. So I want to know, I love to pose this question to you all. What makes talking about race so uncomfortable? We do. That's why. Make it uncomfortable.
I feel like it doesn't have to do about it.
Okay. Okay.
Wait, explain.
Yeah.
I mean, I really think that we make it uncomfortable. Like she was saying before, that it's a social construct, that we make the situation comfortable. If we decide that, hey, we want to talk about the different ways to make Jell-O, then we can sit on Pinterest and find those conversations all day. So why can't we find questions about how to bring our community together in a racial aspect, in a church community aspect? We can't find anything like that as far as on Pinterest, on Tumblr, on anything like that. So I think that we make the conversation hard. Right now, being one of the few black people in this room, I'm uncomfortable for the most part because I choose not to be uncomfortable in the situation. I attend Cedar Springs almost every Sunday that I can, and I don't feel comfortable. I don't feel uncomfortable because I don't choose to feel uncomfortable in the situation. So I think that we choose if we're going, and I appreciate all you guys coming out tonight to have this discussion, with us about that. So, I mean, I think we choose to make the conversation uncomfortable. We choose that for ourselves, unfortunately. We create things in our life that makes it hard as humans, and we don't have to. We don't have to choose to be stressed out. We don't have to choose to be this. We don't have to choose to be that. We all choose how to respond to situations. And if being a Christian, if we choose to have the faith and have the guidance, then all that kind of stuff will kind of go away. So that's my feel.
And then I heard the sister back here, you said you feel like there's nothing you can.
Yeah, doesn't feel like there's a whole lot that I can do about it, which gets frustrating. And you look around in my normal pathways of life are filled with lots and lots of white people, and I love white people. But whenever the issue of race is brought up, I think, okay, what can I do? Who can I? Got nothing.
I think I appreciate that a lot because I can identify with that feeling. But I think there are things that we can do. And I think when we think about racial reconciliation, I think sometimes we think about situations like what Doug talked about, where we get a group of people together and we try to hug each other and, do things or we even churches coming together to do a service project. That's wonderful. That's great. But in reality, I am someone who has grown up entrenched in white culture. I have always been the only black person everywhere. I mean, I went to a church where you're the only black family. I went to a school where I was horribly mistreated by people of my own race. And so that put up barriers in a lot of ways. And so it's really, I am in a season of my life where, in a lot of ways, I'm being reconciled to people of my own race, which is another layer of being incredibly uncomfortable. Can we talk about that? But I am finding that healing comes and reconciliation comes, and this is from my vast 24 years of experience, in relationship. It's not about, getting a group of people together and doing a jig in a circle. It's about me getting to know you and knowing your experiences and who you are and realizing, we're actually not that different, or, oh, wow, that's a really cool perspective on who you are, and having that humility to say, please, help me know who you are and what you've experienced. And I mean, I'm speaking for myself. I don't mind for people to ask me about things related to race. Please do. It means a lot to me when you do. and it gives space to be heard. And that's not something that I think we can experience that often. So I think it can come, what you can do is seek to get to know people who are Black. Like, that sounds so simple, but I think that's a big part of it, is being able to form relationships with people who look different than you and are different from you. I mean, I think that I find is a powerful way for reconciliation to occur and to happen. But it takes effort, and it takes being uncomfortable, and it takes making intentional choices about who you surround yourself with. And, that's not just going to happen, especially if, like, you don't have coworkers who are Black, or you don't have members of your church who are Black. You're going to, it's seeking that out and seeking to be intentional about forming those relationships. I mean, I so appreciate the fact that Doug's like, I'm going to be mentored by a Black teacher. Like, that is an intentional effort and step. And so I feel like I'm talking a long time, but I think that is something that you can do. Yeah.
I actually just have a comment. I kind of want to piggyback off what you were saying, and really just commend Doug of All Souls Church, who spoke earlier and talked about how he wanted to be mentored by Pastor Skinner. And I mean, if you guys don't know Doug, and I heard a little bit about his story today, and it's really kind of amazing, his whole trajectory of how he came from California, and he didn't have any Black friends. He didn't know about any Black experiences. So if you guys can make arrangements to sit and have coffee with him and figure out how he decided to step out of his comfort zone of being this white man with no Black friend experiences and seeking out Pastor Skinner to build a relationship, I think that's a great way to understand how to be intentional about building relationships, to feel helpless in a world where where there's Black people, Asian people, Hispanic people, Black and brown people everywhere, and easily accessible to you. I think, for lack of a better word, and hopefully you won't take it out of context in a safe space, that it's kind of like a cop-out. I studied in Uganda in undergrad, and like Calvin was saying, he and I went to, we're associated with this Christian university in Pennsylvania, and I studied abroad in Africa with a group of Christian students from across the country in Canada. And there, I lost my faith. I stepped out of Christianity after I was going to a predominantly white church before I left, and I was really intentional about being at this predominantly white church, because I grew up in Black churches. And one of my professors challenged the class, if you're in a racially homogenous church, then you're probably in a place that doesn't represent the kingdom. So you need to be intentional about going out and being a part of a church that's, that doesn't look like what you're used to. So I went out, started going to this Presbyterian church, and it was uncomfortable. But I love the sermons. I always felt like all the relationships that I was building felt really contrived. I went there for a year. Then I studied abroad in Africa. And among these white students from across the country, it was 38 of us, and I was one of only 2 Black students out of that group. And the students that I studied with, they were more interested in building relationships with the African students than they were with the 2 Black students who came from the States with them. And anytime we talked about issues in the classroom, issues about poverty and stuff, and I was really outspoken at the time. I'm not anymore. I would bring up these issues back in the States, and they did not want to hear it. They did not want to hear it. Here it is, this Black girl from the States reminding us of our issues that we have back home, And I left Africa so discouraged and so disenchanted by integrating churches and integrating congregations that I left the faith. I just actually came back to Christianity this year. But I struggled with all of these things for 5 years, and just like, even today, it's very hard for me to go to a predominantly white church. it's very hard for me to trust that white Christians have the best interest of black communities at heart, that they'd rather, that white Christians would rather spend their money on Africans and Japanese people and saving Muslims in other countries than they would saving, or not even saving, but contributing and being a part of progression for people right here in their own country, in the urban parts of their states. And, you know, I mean, right now, we're struggling in your state right now, we're struggling to get, you know, Medicaid expansion for, you know, some of the most impoverished people in your state, you know, and a lot of times the people who are fighting against it are people who are Christians and who don't feel like, you know, feel like they want to give more handouts to people who aren't working, you know. But if you got to know these people in these communities, in these black communities who work 2 jobs, a lot of times work 2 jobs, paying minimum wage to take care of a family. And yeah, they have 3 kids and they're probably single parents, but, you know, there's a lot of systemic stuff going on in these communities that you really have to get in there and build relationships to learn about, you know. So take a page out of Doug's book and try to, you know, sit with him and see what he's doing, because I think that we can learn a lot, and we shouldn't feel helpless about building relationships with each other.
Please, can I just build off that as a transition point? Our friend Mike Kuhn, who used to work on staff here at Cedar Springs, next month will be sharing with us about a different dynamic of understanding and growing with Muslims in here and abroad, and how do we think about Islam. But he's got a perspective on things that he says, are we willing to seek to understand life through the eyes of the other, quote unquote, whomever the other is? Not simply for the sake of, hey, I understand something about you, but so that we can know them and then kind of move from there toward them of a philosophy of incarnational life versus confrontational life. Confrontational dynamics come from a lot of assumptions. Incarnational life comes from discomfort and moving into it, and seeking understanding. But it is the discomfort that just raises up when we start talking about that. So I appreciate the challenge of this and the conversation that we continue. So did somebody else have a question?
Hi, Matt. Hi, Janetta. First of all, I love what you had to say earlier. I just wanted to say that. One thing, have any of the panelists or anybody in here seen a 60 Minutes interview that Morgan Freeman did within the past year?
Mm-hmm.
I hate that nobody in this room has seen this. Well, basically, Mike Wallace is interviewing Morgan Freeman, and one of his opening lines to him is, "So, Black History Month's coming up. How do you feel about that?" Mm-hmm. And Morgan Freeman's response was, that's what you got to talk about? And he goes, "First of all, I'm not that excited about it." And he goes, "Can you expound upon that?" And his exact words are, "Black history is American history in the context of what you're talking about." And he proceeds to go on and say, do you want white history? And Mike Wallace backtracks about as fast as I've ever seen anybody in an interview and starts, blah, 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 I'm Jewish. Tries to side with him on a minority standpoint. And he says, do you want Jewish History Month? He says, no, but I don't want it either because it separates us. And I loved every word he had to say, but, the point I'm getting at here is, at the end of it, he said, the more and more that we separate each other from one another, the more and more we're going to have this cyclical problem. He said, I'm going to stop calling you a white man, and hopefully you'll stop calling me a black man. And I think that is the key to ending racism of any sort, of any candor at all. Mm-hmm. Would you guys agree with that? That there are that when folks start talking about, or stop talking about the differences that people experience with each other,
Can you guys respond?
that would lead into that.
Yeah, if I could start. I've often heard of a similar situation that Kelly described, having always grown up in white communities, and I think some folks would even call me assimilated, and having even some negative experiences with other black people. So I often get I don't really see you as black. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've heard that. And
Preach. Preach.
And I just so badly want to say, no, it's important that you see me as black and you shift your idea about what you think a black person is. But it's important that you see me as black because a lot comes with that. You know, because of the social construct we've created, but it does exist. We can't pretend it doesn't exist to undo it. We have to work through it instead of just deciding, well, we're all the same, it's good now. Because it's not. Because if you look at the fact that we have separate communities, the fact that a certain kind of folk live in East Knoxville, we created that, we made that happen, and that's problematic. And so we have to talk about it and talk through it and figure out how to get back on track where people have equal opportunities to live wherever they want to live and raise their children wherever they want to and go to the schools that they want to go to. But we can't do that if we just kind of wipe the slate clean, all's fair. I'm not sure that's exactly what you're saying. I don't want to accuse you of that, but it's kind of a similar thing that if we don't acknowledge and really go into it, it's probably going to look something like that.
What I mean is that as a catalyst, I mean, 200 years from now, looking back, I mean, that's what I'm doing. When Morgan Freeman was getting
Anybody else want to speak to that? Right.
This is a thought that is not fully formulated, and I'm an external processor, so bear with me, but I don't know. I find that really that makes me really uncomfortable. And because there is a history there. And I don't think that you can, and we are different, and that's not a bad thing, you know? And so I think sometimes when we go down that road, we fail to celebrate some of those differences that make our culture wonderful. You know, I don't know. That makes me uncomfortable, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Because I think differences, I don't think that's always a bad thing. And I feel like that didn't really add that much value, but I don't know. I don't know if I agree with Morgan Freeman on that, but yeah.
So you're saying Morgan Freeman does not speak for every black person in America?
Yes, believe it or not.
Sometimes
He is the voice of God sometimes.
And in the same way, y'all, if I'm the one black person in the room, I am not speaking on behalf of every single black human on the earth, okay? I just need to say that.
But I think this dynamic speaks to the complexity of this and why it doesn't get worked out in holy huddles. Does that make sense? Like that verbiage, what Doug was talking about, because I was at some of those too, and they made me uncomfortable. It speaks to the complexity of this issue. Because it's funny when you ask, I've been in rooms where somebody says, well, Janetta, what do black people think about this? I have never had a person of a different ethnicity ask me, Doug, what do white people think about this? I'm just acknowledging, I'm a white suburban kid from Cincinnati. My experience is very different than Calvin's friend who grew up from Gatlinburg and felt on the outside of it. It's an interesting dynamic.
First, thank you all for this discussion. It's a really important discussion and a really heavy discussion to have. And I think I have a little bit of a different perspective going on what Matt was saying earlier. I'm originally from the Bahamas, so I've been majority black most of my life. We have, white people are actually the minority in the Bahamas. It's really funny how that worked, but there's not that narrative. Before I moved here in 2008, I identified as Bahamian. White Bahamians identified as Bahamians. Asian Bahamians identified as Bahamians. That was my story. That's what I celebrated. And it wasn't really until I moved here in 2008, where I found myself in the narrative of being black. That was not my identity, but I was made painfully aware, especially since when I first moved here, I lived in Townsend, Tennessee. Not many people with my hue close by, but I was made painfully aware of the fact that I was black. And I think when we talk about, that social construct with race, I prefer to see it as a story, because in that, being black is not just me being by myself black. There's a story behind that. There's people that have fought for who I am. It's in my genes. There's a culture that's been ingrained in my mind. There's literally layers upon layers, thousands of years of layers of being black going into that story. So I have two questions going like that. How do you approach that? I don't expect everybody to leave here and bum rush majority places, black places in Knoxville. But how do you approach that narrative? Not ignoring it, but how do you approach that narrative and make it one narrative? Does that make sense what I'm asking?
Can you rephrase for me?
Yeah, I'll rephrase it. So how do you approach this idea of racial reconciliation without ignoring the narrative that's behind that? Because I think what a lot of people think is we'll just be one people. We'll forget everything that happened in the past. We'll be good for the future kingdom of God. Yay. But realizing that there's a long and vivid story, and I think trying to get the two stories to meet. And I do have a second question, not completely different, but in the past several months, and even the past several years, there's been just a wide array of incidences of young black men being killed by white police officers. And you'll see articles pop up everywhere on Facebook, and I think it annoys people a lot. You see hundreds of articles, but not really a response from the church. And I think people, to avoid that conversation, make it a political issue. So you have those who will fight for it and justify what happened, or you have those who will completely fight against it and say why all white police officers should start carrying cameras and all this stuff. But instead of making it a political issue, what is the kingdom response to that issue? I kind of really hold dear to Paul's words where he says, weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice. So what would be the kingdom response to issues like that and not the political response? So two questions.
Well, I'll try to tackle that last question. A quote that resonates with me is from Martin Luther King Jr., where he said, true peace isn't the absence of tension, but the presence of justice. True peace isn't the absence of tension, but it's the presence of justice. As kingdom ambassadors, we have to recognize that our efforts to stand in the gap, to speak on behalf of those who don't necessarily have voices, to be advocates of those who are oppressed, takes great effort, great commitment, and a willingness to be uncomfortable. And what's wonderful that the majority of us right here, right, are, I guess, 30s, 40s?
Yeah, 30s. Yeah.
And even, beyond that, that everything it's going to take to address these matters, to engage these issues, to try to work out these issues. Everything we need to address these issues is right here. We have the resources, we have the know-how, we have the relationships, we have the connections to work it out. to figure it out and even be an example, be a model, be a catalyst to transform, to recognize the gaps with the justice complex, the prison industrial complex. We have the opportunity to address the matters of human trafficking. We have what it takes. But the question is, are we willing to commit?
The Ferguson, it just torn me up. And if you follow it, Christianity Today has been covering it quite a bit. And one of the writers that I've really been following is Christina Cleveland. Mm-hmm. And she has a really well-written blog, and she's a professor up in somewhere in the north. And several African-American writers and leaders wrote blogs in Christianity Today, which is kind of the magazine that most evangelical pastors read, pleading for me to address it from the pulpit. Yes. Pleading. Yes. Saying, look, you just can't say, wait till all the facts are, you've got to say something. And I haven't. And I've talked about it with friends and some things like that. I'm not sure why I haven't. I have wondered if I'll go to my grave and regret that I didn't, and whether I am the man who in 1960 didn't say anything about segregation in the church because it just seemed inappropriate.
Let me build on this, and it's interesting, a couple things that have been said particularly about discomfort, and let's acknowledge in the last 15 minutes, the discomfort level in the room went up, didn't it? Because we started talking specifically. And that's okay. I mean, on some level, it went up. Particularly when we talk about reconciliation, reconciliation with God requires discomfort. First, on his part, what did it require? It required the death of his son. And then what does it say about us in understanding that? God's kindness is what leads us to repentance. But repentance means acknowledging something. It means acknowledging sin. I don't like to think about sin. I don't know about you. This is what this is stirring up in me. So I say that to say that's not only a model, if I can say it that way. A model isn't quite enough. It's also a means. Like, as I begin to apprehend the reality of that, Christ on the cross, so that we might be reconciled, Christ's love compels me to move out. But the discomfort is just, I've done many of the same things that Doug has, where I'll talk about it with you and you and you, but I will not speak it if I think there will be a resisted presence in the room. But the discomfort seems the tension, I think it has to be there. But it doesn't have to, tension isn't bad. I like that word.
And I think at the same time, I think that having these conversations that we think that we have to, take on the, big issues, and we kind of can think of ourselves as like being very small. And what you said, Calvin, about Martin Luther King, one point that he made was that, I won't say the quote exactly, but he emphasized that you don't have to have a college degree to serve. You don't have to, have certain credentials to serve. You have to have a heart generated by grace, or a soul steeped in love. And of course, I'm summarizing that. And I think that's the point, is that individually, in the decisions that we make on a daily basis, am I going to, talk to this person? What assumptions am I carrying around when I interact with an African American or a Latino person? If we consciously address and kind of open up our hearts to individuals who may be different from us, I think that is what's going to change the world, our individual actions. And I think even I have the tendency to think that you have to be MLK or you have to go out and you have to, take on big issues. But I think it's individually, what am I doing and how am I opening my heart up to other people and how am I living my life daily? Because that, our individual interactions make up how our society is formed. And I think that we can each be impactful in terms of how we interact with other people and people who are different from ourselves.
I'm particularly saddened by, well, first of all, let me back up and say I'm a parent, and both of my kids have graduated from college and have found good jobs in town, and they've stayed here and they're growing their lives here. And most of my African American professional friends' kids have not found good jobs here and are growing their lives here. And that saddens me maybe more than anything else about this issue as it relates to Knoxville. And so, does anybody in this room, whether it be panelists or anybody else, have any ideas about how Knoxville can be more friendly to our African American young people who grow up here and want to be young professionals and would like to stay in this community?
Yeah, wow, that's wow. I guess my initial, response that I'll share, first of all, 'cause I share that sentiment. I have the wonderful privilege of growing up with some church folks who are now gone off to do wonderful things. They're engineers building homes, they're on their second and third home. They're executives at, Fortune, 200 companies. And actually, a couple of my advisors, mentors are here from my church who poured into them, greatly. And you see that how much they have been prospering and how they have contributed to their communities. They will express they want to do the same here. They would love to do the same in Knoxville, but like you said, the opportunities are very limited. So I honestly would ask the question. I would, pose the question. I don't know who it should go to or who could address this, but I wonder why, out of all the cities that Knoxville compare with in the South, that we're lagging, like all the cities down in the southern region have been growing exponentially in embracing blacks and young black professionals, but Knoxville seems to be lagging behind. Nashville doing great, Charlotte, Memphis, Atlanta, but Knoxville, Houston, but Knoxville seems to be the one city lagging. Why? Why?
It should be noted that at the same time, Knoxville is the fourth fastest growing city in the United States the last 10 years.
Interesting.
What? Seriously?
Knoxville, Charlotte, Raleigh-Durham area, Greenville, South Carolina are all in the top 10. Knoxville's number 4, the fastest growing city in the U.S.
And yet we're still lagging in diversity. That's astonishing.
Did any of you ladies have any comment about this dynamic here in Knoxville? What do we do about that?
I think it's complicated. I've been living here for going on my 7th year, and I've seen a lot of my African American and counterparts come here, have a certain opportunity, and then get to a certain point in their career and want to advance and can't find anything here and they end up moving to another city that will offer them the opportunities to expand and grow in their career. So back in November of last year, I worked with the Commission for Blacks at the University of Tennessee to invite, Mayor Rogero and Phyllis Nichols and some other community leaders to talk about this issue, like what's going on that's particular to Knoxville, where African Americans, and I also believe that when one group can't enter the space, that doesn't provide that, doesn't allow for other diverse groups to enter the space in Knoxville. And I think it's a combination from, talking to other leaders, it's a combination of opportunities, even Mayor Rojero's, I think her son had to move to another city. I don't know if it's her son or daughter, but she talks about them having to move to another city because there was a lack of opportunities and jobs here in Knoxville for her child to pursue. And then I think it's also what you can get in Houston and Atlanta and Nashville, and I would even argue Chattanooga right now is a diversity of experience and, connecting with different people. And when you're in those spaces or in those cities, Knoxville, it has progressed since I've been here for 6 years, but it still lags in terms of offering those opportunities to not just be focused in on your job and your work, but to have a life outside where you're able to have diverse experiences.
That's, I don't know, but Doug, the book that you put out, is that out anywhere, the Seek the Peace of the City?
Free download on our
Okay, and I'm pulling you into this because chapter 1 of Doug's book called Seek the Peace of the City addresses Knoxville particular in the wounds and the scars. I guess I'm just asking a little bit, can you give a little bit of context to the Knoxville dynamic that's unique to Knoxville? However long you want to, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but that was a really, as a person who's not from Knoxville and has realized Knoxville's unique in the South on many levels, in different ways, that helped me. Is there something connected with that, with this question?
Actually, I think Lawrence could probably answer that better.
Well, this is coming from a white perspective, unfortunately, but in looking at Knoxville's history, which I have a lot, one of the great things about Knoxville was that Knoxville was pro-union during the Civil War South because it was not plantation dominated like the rest of the South. What that means, though, practically, is that there's a relatively small African American population here. And so when integration occurred, there was actually a loss of black professional positions because the black market could go to the entire community, not just a segment of the community. And so black professionals started moving away to other cities like Atlanta, where there were more opportunities with people in higher positions that could mentor them. And that's become a self-fulfilling prophecy, I believe. And more when you don't see somebody in a president's position in a bank, and you're an African American person, and you don't see somebody in that position, but you see it in another city, you're going to have more opportunities in that other city. And so we lose our best and brightest. And we do research at the foundation I run every 5 years. And one of the greatest changes that has occurred in the last 10 years is increasingly majority community kids that have moved away want to come back here and grow their careers here, and they find opportunities here. Majority community kids increasingly want to stay here if they go to the University of Tennessee, and they find opportunities here. But we are still losing our best and brightest African American kids. And that just hurts if you care about this community.
Just African American kids, or is it
Just African American kids. Now, it's not to say that white kids don't move away and don't come back, But if they want to find a place here, there's a place for them. And increasingly, because of the stronger downtown, they find the creative community, they find social opportunities, they find ways to meet each other, they find ways to find mates, they find ways to find jobs, they get mentored in those jobs, and they can move up in those jobs. But 2 years ago, when I was interviewing African American leaders one-on-one, and white leaders one-on-one, I was finding in the white community, increasingly young people want to come here or stay here and grow their lives here and are finding opportunities. But it was a stark contrast that the African American community was still losing its best and brightest.
Is that true of the Asian community?
No,
Hispanic community, just
no, African American community.
Any other?
Okay, so I guess the point I want to make, I have a daughter who went to UT, graduated from Bearden, went to UT, has her master's in civil engineering, and I'm very proud of her. And I have a son too. I don't want to act like I only have one. But she wanted to leave Knoxville because she wanted to explore other cities, and I applaud her for that, because where I grew up in Pittsburgh, I wanted to leave Pittsburgh, you know, and I came to Knoxville, you know, I was excited. And I think it was a far exciting place in the 80s, 70s and 80s, and I think I could see the decline. I could see more separation as I got older. There's just not that many things, you know, for African Americans to do here in Knoxville. It just isn't. It's getting a little bit better, but I'm older now, and I think my crowd is probably finding more things to do than the younger crowd is, perhaps. But just to say, what I'd like to see Knoxville do is reach out to African Americans and other in other states, cities, and bring them in. Because I came in, I was transitioned in, and most of my friends were transitioned in. You know, and if we can attend, you know, conferences like the National Black Society of Engineering Conference, where there's the best and brightest engineers that attend that conference. If the corporations in Knoxville can attend these conferences, they can bring in the bright the bright career-minded individuals. And then our Chamber of Commerce and all you folks that, you know, do all the planning on what Knoxville should look like, well, maybe you should start including, you know, well, maybe we need to have some more cultural diversity in this movie thing downtown, you know. And the Tuesday night jazz is good, but, you know, you have to start thinking about maybe if you want to bring in a more diverse crowd, you've got to have a little bit more diverse entertainment. Need some new blood in some of these positions here in Knoxville, and entertain different forms of entertain different entertainment. You know, Kumba Festival, okay, that's about it. But we need more. We need more than that. But again, you know, everybody doesn't want to stay here, but bring some folks in. You know, bring people in.
Right, Moldy.
Kelly, you mentioned earlier something that kind of caught my attention. You mentioned part of your story has been just kind of working through, I can't remember the word you used, I guess like friction or just hurt or wounds from kind of within your own race. Is there anything from that chapter of your story, is there anything that that's worth, that you want us to know, that's worth sharing? Or
just that figuring out what it means to be a black woman has been hard. just because, and anyway, I'm just going to talk. Okay, so I try really hard to formulate thoughts in my head, and I can't do it. I'm an external processor. I just need to own it. I need to own it. So I was homeschooled for a really long time. I was homeschooled till 8th grade, and then when I went to school, I found myself very isolated from people of my own race, and that was very hard for me because up until that point, I had never thought about the fact that I was black and you're black and you're white. We didn't have those conversations in my home. I knew about kind of our history as a people, but I didn't ever really think about what that meant for me. And I found, it was hard. It was hard. I was really kind of isolated and sort of ridiculed. And there was this kind of constant question of well, why are you trying to be white? Or those kinds of things. And which called into question, well, what does it mean to be black? And clearly I don't do that well. And so it's created in me this insecurity that I'm not a good black person. Which I don't even know what that means or would look like. I don't, and so, but it caused me to put up walls around myself where I found it I was not comfortable in engaging with people of my own race. And I wasn't in an environment where I did it a ton. And my parents, they've expressed many times the regret that they have for that. Apart from my family, all of my friends were white. We attended a church where I was, we were the only black, and that wasn't weird for me. I'm used to that. I'm more comfortable in that environment than I am surrounded by people of my own race. It sounds bonkers, but it just is the reality of my life. And so I am on a journey in a way of becoming comfortable in my own skin and owning who I am as a woman and as a black woman. And I think a big step in that has been realizing that does not define me. In reality, what defines me is the fact that I'm the daughter of the King of Kings and I'm created in his image. And so if I'm rooted in that, then I can engage with anybody. If I'm rooted in that, then absolutely I can have relationships with people who look the same as me or who don't look the same as me. And so, it's a weird story and it's hard to talk about. I feel guilty about it. There is, that it makes other black people look bad. I don't know. It's just, even in talking about it, I'm I don't want to offend anyone in the room, particularly the other black people in this room. It's just hard. It's hard. And I feel I often don't have the right perspective so that in itself is a whole nother layer to all of this for me. It's not just about how I relate to people who are white, and that has its own set of challenges and, but also how I relate to people who are also black, so it's a weird journey, but it's really sweet. And I have found that healing has come as I've had more relationships with people. It's come in relationship. It's come and sitting down and getting to know you and knowing who you are and realize what? I can be me and you can be you and it doesn't matter. We're two black women sitting here and, and so it's come in relationship. So yeah, I don't know if that's just part of that story. So
I think that's common too, because for me growing up in Belleville, Michigan, with, I was the black student in the college preparatory classes with majority white people. And what I did for myself was decided to attend a historically black institution, all female too, on top of it, because I wanted to build a connection with African Americans. And what I learned from being in that environment, being in that school, was that African American females are diverse. You take somebody from California to Tennessee to Atlanta to Belleville, Michigan, and we all have diverse experiences, diverse opinions, and we share some things, but we're really, really, really diverse. And that's how for me, like growing up in Belleville, Michigan, was isolating, and I, overcompensated, and, but at the same time, going to Spelman College was a means for me to connect and learn, how diverse African American women are and our experiences and, what we decide to pursue. And so I think it plays out differently for different people.
Nathan, we'll do one more question, because I know all of us up here haven't eaten. We want to eat, bluntly put. But we'll do one more question. Nathan? Yeah.
Well, just a couple of you mentioned about being or feeling like you're a statistic. So as a business leader here in town, and then also I serve on Knox County Council PTA as an officer, and one of the things I've tried to do is be intentional with expanding diversity, both in my work and then with the PTA, and really being vocal and talking about that. How can we go about being intentional, expanding diversity, without making people feel like a statistic or a box that we can check?
One of the things I teach in therapy all the time is talking about how we talk about, and just that question you asked, how do I do that? You can say that. How do I do this? How do I bring you in? This is what I'm thinking. This is how I'm feeling. I'm nervous about talking to you about this. I don't want you to feel like a statistic, but I want you here because I think you have some value from your different cultural perspective. So just say it, just like you did. Just say, how do I do this with you? Because it's going to be different per individual, but that's a lot of power in that.
Yeah. I'm going to wrap this up. And I think I love that response, because what does that, the picture of that is vulnerability, being vulnerable. We hate to be vulnerable, don't we? We don't want to be vulnerable. And this is the picture of it too, because I forget who said it, but so much of life we're taught metaphorically or internally to live like this, aren't we? Just in case. Just in case. This is vulnerable. To say, tell me, because I know I'm going to stumble over this and screw this up, and I don't know. And that's in a broad citywide perspective to the smallest conversation I've had, to ask a personal thing of my friend Shad, who lives in Baltimore now, who I grew up with in suburb, but his parents moved into that suburb so he could get a good education, and they worked their tails off, and he was a dear friend. But where was he on the weekends? He wasn't in our town. He went so that he could exhale, where he wasn't one of 3 black guys in the room, one of 2 guys on the team, so the older we got, we talked about that, and he was willing to share with me. And he went to college at Wittenberg University. Probably most of you don't even know where Wittenberg University is. I'm just going to say, it's one of the whitest places on earth, Wittenberg University. It's a little Lutheran university in Springfield, Ohio, to play football. He left after a year because he couldn't breathe. But we talked after that year, and he said, Doug, I love you guys. Right now, I got enough white friends. So I'm sharing that experience, not to just as a friend who, if he were sitting here, would say that. And I said, it didn't compute until he said that to me, what his context and what his daily life was compared to mine. And it was kind of, oh, I never thought about that. So I bring that up because in some form or fashion, I'm praying that this conversation is something of that for us. And it's a vulnerability. And so just that's kind of a final thought, for lack of a better word or a phrase, but I want to thank you all so much for tonight.